morning. It's nice to see you all, see some familiar faces again. For those who don't know me, I was on the Vision team last year. So I'm honored to be here this morning and to share my story with you all. Also lovely to see my friends from my spiritual community, People of the Heart, as well. So I'll be reading the word from tradition from an ecumenical Bible, and I'm going to actually start with Romans 12:9. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. I'll be sharing my word from today later after I share a little bit of my story. I chose these verses from Paul's letter to the Romans for two reasons that speak to me of my own spiritual journey. First was his message to be patient in suffering and to weep with those who weep. Second, the passages to let love be genuine, love one another with mutual affection, and live peaceably with all. I do believe that through our grief and our shared suffering, we become capable of breaking open our hearts to each other, to the world, to love. Collectively, we experienced this in the days following 9/11. The world came to a standstill for a time. We stepped away from our busy lives and came together as a nation. People began to question the meaning of life. It wasn't how much stuff we had. It was about family, friends. Was I loved? What is the purpose for my life? We were kind to one another. And that was the world I wanted to live in. Unfortunately, although we did weep for a time together, we weren't encouraged by our leaders to be patient in our suffering. Instead, we were instructed to get back to normal. And as most of us know, nothing has been normal since. You may be wondering why or how this relates to my own spiritual evolution from organized religion, in this case Christianity, to the death of God and a rebirth of a deep ecumenical spirituality in my life and in my work as an artist. It's not an uncommon story. I underwent a similar personal journey of grief, transformation, and awakening that broke open my heart to the world. The wisdom and compassion that emerged out of my suffering 20 plus years ago continues to guide my life today. As the Greek playwright Aeschylus wrote, "In our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until, in our despair, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." Like most of us, I inherited my particular faith tradition from my family of origin. I was raised Protestant in a small New England town. My parents weren't religious people, and we didn't speak of faith in the home. But my mother wanted to give her 5 children some religious grounding, and so we attended Sunday service at our local congregational church. It was called Pilgrim Church, and it gave us a sense of belonging, community. We celebrated the holy days with friends and families. After our minister was asked to leave for being too liberal, and tired of struggling to get her teens out of bed on Sunday morning, my mother decided that our church-going days were over. As the youngest of 5, I didn't get a chance to study the Bible or get confirmed in church. But later I joined Campfire Girls. It's a Christian-based teen organization. I wrote this passage in my Bible. The day when I really started to believe in God was when I went to Pioneer Girls. What's interesting to me is that I had a relationship at the time with God, but strangely not with Christ. As I got older and with the social movements of the 70s, I moved away from the church, but continued to believe in a benevolent God that was going to look over my family and myself. I was wrong. Today is a day of mourning for our nation. It's a day of remembering lives lost too soon and the families left behind to bear the weight of their grief. This has also been a day of mourning for myself and my family for 22 years. Today is the anniversary of my beloved brother Richard's death from AIDS. He was my mentor and my inspiration, my biggest cheerleader. He was 39 and I was 29. He was the only son, the oldest, and I was the youngest. Separated in 10 years almost to the day, he played a Svengali-like role in my education and evolution. He taught me to be fearless, and he continues to inspire me even in his death. I miss him, and I'm thinking about him today. In 1989, people believed you could get AIDS from toilet seats or simply being in the proximity of someone who had the disease. There was a lot of fear, and the average life expectancy was 18 months from time of diagnosis. AIDS was a death sentence. But I prayed to God to save Richard. I prayed when he went to get tested. I prayed he would be one of the lucky ones and make it. I'd always felt our family was somehow blessed and looked over by God, but my prayers went unanswered, and I watched him slip away before me on this day 22 years ago. It's an image etched into my memory that can never be erased. But for me, this day also marks the beginning of my spiritual journey. I didn't know it at the time. It was also when I began to divorce myself from God and the Christian tradition, in part due to our religious and political leaders at the time, telling me and telling others, telling the world that my brother deserved to die this horrific death because of his sexual orientation. My family and I grieved deeply for my brother, especially my mother. She and Richard, her only son, were very close. It was unbearable at times to witness her suffering, and she smoked more heavily in her grief. I tried to care for my mother as Richard had asked of me prior to his death, and to find strength knowing Richard would want me to carry on. But I failed at both. 9 months later, while I was on vacation in Bora Bora, I wrote a postcard to my mother, telling her that Richard must be there. The remote tropical island was like paradise. Heaven on earth, I wrote. She never got that card. She died suddenly the night before I returned home. My heart ached. Both my brother and my mother were now gone. Alone in my grief, I began a descent into substance abuse, trying to numb the pain. My mother had been the center of our family, and her death broke us apart. Once believing that as long as I had my family, I could survive anything, I now found myself suddenly orphaned. Looking back, I can say that I entered into what St. John of the Cross, the great Christian mystic, said was a dark night of the soul. Darkness pervaded my world. People around me said that life goes on. Get back to normal. But nothing was normal again. There was little patience for my suffering. I had few to weep with, and I was angry at God. Why would a loving God allow so much suffering? I felt abandoned by God, and so I abandoned him. That was a very dark period in my life, and I believe two things saved me from what I believe could have been my own premature death. My art painting my heart on the canvas and finding a compassionate therapist to bear witness and affirm my experience. It's why I believe so passionately in the power of art to heal and the power of listening to heal the wounded heart. Over time, like a butterfly emerging from the chrysalis, I began to slowly emerge from the darkness and saw the world with new eyes. I read books on philosophy and theology, searching for the meaning of life. I discovered Buddhism in the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying that speaks to suffering and the impermanent nature of existence. I read my brother's journals and found strength in the wisdom of his words and poetry. And I discovered deep compassion for all beings, especially those who are grieving, and a desire to be of service to the greater good. Over the next decade, I did activism around AIDS, volunteered with the NAMES Project, and I also started an AIDS education and outreach program for women in AIDS. Later, I found my way to the Dougy Center here in Portland, where I worked with grieving children and families. My own family began to heal, and we came together as a family once again.